February 14, 1933. 4:32 a.m. The basement under the Cotton Club was a concrete box breathing damp winter air, with one naked light bulb swinging like a metronome above a single man's head. 12 gunmen, Dutch Schultz's best, stood in a loose circle, coats dripping, fingers tightening, expecting a clean execution and a clean message. Harlem would be purchased with fear. In the center, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 27, didn't plead. He watched the shadows more than the faces, listened to the small sounds, shoes shifting, a safety clicking, a nervous swallow, and then lifted his eyes to that bulb like it was the only thing in the room that mattered. What kind of man survives 12 barrels in a locked basement? And what kind of neighborhood turns that survival into a law? Minutes later, one man would crawl out, alive, clutching something stranger than a wound. An ace of spades, smeared with blood and meaning, carrying a whisper that would spread through Harlem like smoke. Harlem doesn't sell. To understand why that basement became a legend, Harlem has to be seen the way Harlem felt in the 1930s. Not as a backdrop, but as a pressure cooker. The Great Depression had turned honest work into a lottery. For black families, banks were doors that stayed locked, insurance was a paper promise that never paid out, and the police were often less protection than negotiation. Uniforms that could be rented for the right envelope. In that vacuum, an underground economy didn't arrive like a criminal invasion. It arrived like oxygen. The engine of that economy was the numbers racket. Every morning, men in fedoras and women with tired hands placed small bets, nickels, dimes, a dollar, on three-digit combinations tied to horse tracks, stock figures, anything that looked official enough to feel like fate. To outsiders, it was gambling. To Harlem, it was a chance to outrun humiliation. A few cents could mean a week of groceries, rent paid on time, medicine for a child who coughed through the night. The numbers weren't just money. They were hope disguised as a habit. But cash like that doesn't stay invisible. It draws predators the way light draws moths. By the early 1930s, Harlem's numbers world was not just profitable, it was strategic. Whoever controlled it controlled a river of money that never stopped flowing, even when the city pretended not to see it. That river attracted men who didn't care about Harlem's people, only Harlem's receipts. One of the most feared was Dutch Schultz, a Bronx-born operator known for moving fast and punishing slower. In street accounts, Schultz didn't enter Harlem with a contract. He entered with intimidation, believing the neighborhood could be treated like any other territory. Taxed, occupied, and stripped. And he wasn't alone. Italian families watched from the edges, calculating, waiting for the chaos to soften the ground. Standing in Schultz's way was Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of numbers, a woman who fought harassment in courts and newspapers, who knew that legitimacy mattered even in the underworld because legitimacy shaped the community's loyalty. But St. Clair also knew something colder. Lawsuits didn't stop bullets. Harlem needed a shield that could think. That shield became Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy arrived with a reputation that didn't fit neatly into fear. He was dangerous, yes, but he was also disciplined. He listened more than he spoke. He learned people's debts and their weaknesses the way other men learned gun models. In Harlem, that mattered because survival was communal. A gangster could terrorize a block for a night, but a man who paid hospital bills, kept predators away from women on the street, and enforced a code, loyalty and respect, could become something else. A protector wearing the suit of a criminal. That's what made Harlem different. It wasn't just a place criminals fought over. It was a place where the community quietly chose who deserved to remain standing. And when Dutch Schultz decided to settle the question in a basement under the Cotton Club, he was fighting more than one man. He was testing the will of a neighborhood that had already learned to survive without permission. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson never looked like the loud kind of kingpin. He didn't need to. In Harlem, the loud ones were often the first to be buried. Bumpy carried himself with a calm that felt deliberate, like every movement was measured against consequences no one else could see yet. There were small habits that people remembered long after they forgot the details. The way he folded his napkin before he stood, the way he let silence hang until the other man filled it with mistakes, the way he could make a room feel smaller without raising his voice. Harlem street accounts say he carried a straight razor from his teens. Not because he loved violence, but because the object itself was a warning. A razor didn't shout, promised precision. Bumpy's rule was simple enough to be repeated, complex enough to be feared. Loyalty and respect. Not as poetry, as policy. If someone in Harlem was hungry, he wanted them fed. If someone was being hunted for sport, he wanted the hunters reminded that this neighborhood had teeth. That reputation, half protector, half executioner, didn't appear overnight. It formed in the spaces where Harlem's laws ended and Harlem's needs began. Across from Bumpy stood men who wanted Harlem for different reasons, and that difference is where the story tightens like a wire. Dutch Schultz wanted Harlem the way a thief wants a safe. Not because the safe mattered, but because the money inside did. Schultz believed fear was a universal language. He believed if he applied enough pressure, beat enough collectors, burn enough corners, leave enough bodies, Harlem would convert fear into obedience. The basement under the Cotton Club was supposed to be the final sentence in that philosophy. 12 gunmen in the dark, and Harlem would learn that resisting him was suicide. Lucky Luciano wanted Harlem for the opposite reason. Luciano wasn't interested in chaos. He treated crime like infrastructure, a system, a machine. Where Schultz spilled blood for territory, Luciano invested in stability for profit. By the mid-1940s, with the world shifting after the war and his own future uncertain, Luciano's priority was predictable income. Harlem's numbers racket was not just rich, it was consistent. But Luciano also understood a truth Schultz never learned. If Harlem felt occupied, Harlem would never stop fighting back. Then there was Big Sam Foster, the betrayal that hurt because it was intimate. Sam was physically imposing, 6'4", built like a wall, the kind of man whose presence settled arguments before they began. He was Bumpy's bodyguard, yes, but also, by Harlem standards, family. Sam protected Bumpy with a loyalty that looked unbreakable until it met the one thing that cracks most codes: desperation. Street accounts describe the offer as clean and obscene. $50,000 placed on the table to make Sam do one thing, one night, one time. Lift a gun behind his friend in front of 300 witnesses. It wasn't greed that made Sam listen. It was the gravity of a hospital bill and a child who needed saving. The cruelest betrayals often arrive wearing a reason that almost sounds noble. Marcus "Smooth" Henderson represented another kind of fracture. Ambition disguised as loyalty. Smooth had been close, trusted, raised. When Bumpy went away, years locked behind federal walls, Smooth kept Harlem's machinery running. 11 years can distort any relationship. In that time, Smooth didn't just guard an empire, he began to feel entitled to it. He learned to negotiate with men Bumpy would have controlled, to take cuts he would have refused, to sign deals in rooms where Bumpy's name wasn't present to stop him. Smooth's betrayal wasn't sudden. It was slow, a quiet decision repeated until it became a new identity. And finally, Sal Bonanno, young and sharp-edged, carrying the arrogance of bloodline. He didn't need to earn respect. He expected it because of the name he carried. In Harlem, that kind of entitlement was dangerous. Sal believed he could walk into a restaurant with 6 armed men, speak disrespect as if it was harmless, and leave with the last word. He didn't understand that in Harlem, the last word belongs to the room, not the loudest mouth. These men weren't circling Bumpy because they all hated him. They were circling him because he stood on something they couldn't buy easily: a neighborhood's memory. Schultz wanted to break it. Luciano wanted to lease it. Sam wanted to survive it. Smooth wanted to inherit it. Sal wanted to insult it. And Bumpy wanted one thing above all: to prove again and again that Harlem could be negotiated with but never owned. Every major shift in Harlem's underworld happened inside a room with limited exits and unlimited consequences. Bumpy Johnson understood that bullets were only one way to control a narrative. The more effective way was to control the stage, lighting, witnesses, distance, and the objects that turned moments into legend. Harlem didn't just remember what happened. Harlem remembered where it happened, what it smelled like, what music was playing, and what sat on the table when the power shifted. The first stage was the Cotton Club basement, a damp concrete chamber tucked beneath glamour. Upstairs, white tuxedos and laughter, jazz bright enough to distract the city from its own hunger. Downstairs, a room designed for disposal. One naked bulb hung from a wire, swinging slightly, casting shadows that stretched into corners like hiding places. Wooden crates sat stacked against the wall. The staircase was narrow, the only exit. The geometry was simple: 12 guns, 1 man, 1 way out. Dutch Schultz's men loved this room because it looked like certainty. Bumpy loved it because certainty is what people stop thinking inside, and thinking is where he lived. Then came Lennox Lounge, Harlem's public heartbeat. It wasn't a basement. It was a sanctuary of noise. Saxophone notes curling through smoke, glasses clinking, laughter spilling into the street. On September 12, 1958, the place was packed. Accounts call it 300 people shoulder to shoulder, a crowd large enough to turn 1 second into a lifetime. Bumpy sat at a corner table with his back to the wall, a glass of Hennessy untouched, as if he wanted the room to notice his calm. Big Sam stood behind him like always. Heavy coat, heavy hands, the outline of a revolver hidden until it wasn't. And Bumpy's trap was already in place. A weapon that looked real, felt real, but had been changed at the only point that mattered. A gun that would promise death, then deliver only soundless shame. Click. The third stage was Small's Paradise, a nightclub that felt like a festival and a courtroom at the same time. Bright lights, loud music, expensive laughter. Marcus Smooth Henderson loved routine, and routine is a leash. He always sat at table 7. Ribs on the plate, cognac in the glass, because the same seat every night makes a man feel untouchable. On June 11, 1963, only 3 days after Bumpy walked free, that routine became a trap. Beneath the table, 3 loyal men rested shotguns against their knees, hidden by shadows and crowded legs. The room was full, accounts say 250 or more, enough witnesses to make any lesson travel faster than an ambulance. Then there was the Stork Club, Manhattan's velvet theater of power. The air was perfume and cigar smoke. The chairs were leather. The lighting was forgiving. It was a place where reputations were polished and destroyed quietly. In a VIP room in 1946, Bumpy sat in a chair that wasn't offered, the chair meant for Lucky Luciano, and placed a briefcase on the table with the casualness of a man setting down groceries. Inside was the most dangerous weapon in that room. Not a gun, but a photograph. An image that threatened to undo the illusion men like Luciano depended on: clean influence, controlled chaos. The Stork Club wasn't chosen because it was safe. It was chosen because it was visible. Because any agreement made there echoed beyond Harlem. The final stage was Wells' Restaurant, the kind of place where the food mattered more than the decor. Ribs, collard greens, warm grease and pepper in the air. About 40 diners filled the room, ordinary people, but ordinary people with memories. Bumpy sat with his wife, eating quietly, folding his napkin the way he always did. When Sal Bonanno walked in with 6 armed bodyguards, he thought he brought control with him. He didn't realize the room was already controlled by something heavier than guns. Debt, gratitude, and a community that had decided, long ago, who belonged. Across all 5 locations, the same strategy ran underneath. Count the men, count the weapons, count the witnesses, then place the right object in the right moment. An Ace of Spades, a modified revolver, a straight razor, a photograph, 6 words. In Harlem, those weren't props. They were verdicts. February 14, 1933, 4:32 a.m. Cotton Club basement. The moment didn't begin with a gunshot, it began with confidence. 12 men certain the math was settled before it started, and 1 man certain the room could be turned into a weapon. Harlem accounts say a hitter named Tommy, nicknamed the Executioner in the kind of street mythology that grows around nights like this, let out a small laugh, as if a basement execution was just another errand. Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. He studied the swing of the bulb, the way shadows stretched and collapsed, the thin air trapped in concrete. "That's it?" he asked, not loud, almost bored. 12 of you." In that half-second of surprise, he reached up and smashed the only light. Glass burst, and darkness arrived like a curtain dropping on a stage. In the black, panic did what bullets couldn't. It broke coordination. A gun barrel knocked another. A man stumbled into crates. Someone fired too early, the sound ricocheting off walls that gave nothing back. Bumpy moved with memory instead of sight, using the room's angles, the staircase's choke point, the way fear makes men freeze and reach for each other. What does a man do when he can't trust his eyes, when he can't trust the man standing beside him? Minutes later, when headlights from an alley cut into the basement like a knife, the story says 11 lay groaning or unconscious in one. Marty Delaney, the one the streets remembered because he lived, crawled up the stairs, trembling, his hands slick, his breathing loud enough to betray him in daylight. Bumpy pressed something into his palm. An ace of spades, smeared and ugly, and gave him the kind of instruction that becomes a rumor before it becomes a quote. Take it back, Harlem tells it. Tell him Harlem doesn't sell. And somewhere above that basement, jazz kept playing for people who would never know they were dancing over a turning point. The legend did what legends do. It grew. It traveled from Harlem to the Bronx, from Boston to Baltimore, not as a police report but as a warning wrapped in a simple image. 12 guns, 1 light bulb, 1 man still standing. Years later, on September 12, 1958, Lennox Lounge. The second confrontation was louder in its silence than any gunfight could have been. The club was packed. 300 witnesses, smoke hanging in layers, trumpet notes climbing the walls and falling back into laughter. Bumpy sat at his corner table with an untouched glass of Hennessy, his back to the wall, his napkin folded with the same careful precision, as if he were eating dinner in his own home. Big Sam Foster stood behind him like always. Huge, loyal-looking, the kind of man you trust because he feels like gravity. But loyalty, Bumpy knew, can be bought when desperation is the salesman. Harlem accounts say the offer was $50,000, clean cash, and a promise. Do it once, do it quickly, do it in public so the message echoes. Sam's hand rose. The revolver appeared. The club's music didn't stop yet. The players didn't understand what was happening until the room understood first. Sam aimed. Sam pulled the trigger. Click. The sound was small, dry, almost pathetic, and it sliced through the room with more force than a gunshot because it meant one thing. Betrayal had been exposed without even earning its violence. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then Bumpy turned slowly, lifted the glass, took a single sip like he was tasting time itself, and spoke the line that Harlem would repeat for decades. I've been counting on you. Not yelling, not furious, almost tender, like a father catching a son in a lie. Bumpy reached into his jacket and placed a thick envelope on the table. Hospital paperwork, bills stamped and settled. The kind of mercy that doesn't belong in a room like this. Sam's face collapsed, not because he was caught, but because he realized the deeper cruelty. Bumpy had known, and instead of killing him, Bumpy had chosen a punishment that would follow him longer than a bullet. You wanted money for your child, the implication said, without needing the words. You could have asked. Harlem watched Sam's knees weaken under the weight of being spared. And then Bumpy made it official, not with violence but with exile. Sam was escorted out alive, ordered to leave Harlem and carry the story to every man who thought a bribe could outsmart a neighborhood. The lesson landed hard. In Harlem, the worst outcome isn't dying. It's living without a place to return to. Then the calendar flipped backward in memory to 1946, Stork Club VIP room. A different kind of confrontation, where the weapons were reputation and calculation, and the air smelled expensive enough to make crime look respectable. Lucky Luciano sat with men like Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia in the kind of quiet that only powerful people can afford. This room wasn't Harlem. It was Manhattan's polished lie. A place where the underworld wore tuxedos and spoke like businessmen. Bumpy walked in and did the first thing that mattered. He sat in a seat that wasn't offered. No grand speech, just a message in posture. He wasn't here to beg for Harlem, he was here to define the terms. Luciano offered numbers like they were destiny. 40%. Harlem lore says. A percentage meant to sound generous while still meaning ownership. Bumpy didn't argue. He opened a briefcase and slid a photograph onto the table. An image that threatened a man's control of the narrative, the kind of picture that turns whispers into investigations and friends into liabilities. The room went still, not because anyone feared a gun, but because everyone understood what exposure costs. Luciano's smile tightened. He studied Bumpy's face. looking for panic, for bluff, for desperation. Found none. And that was the moment the negotiation tilted. 10, Bumpy answered. Harlem repeats, not as a plea but as a verdict. 10%, and no Italian soldiers in Harlem. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Business could happen, profit could flow, but Harlem would not be occupied. Luciano weighed the photograph against the percentage, weighed the long game against the ego, and then, because he was the kind of boss who valued survival over pride, he accepted. Hands shook, and history shifted without a shot fired, proving a truth the streets rarely admit. The cleanest victories happen when violence is kept holstered and leverage is placed on the table like a blade. The fourth confrontation came later, when time itself became a character. June 11, 1963, Small's Paradise, 3 days after Bumpy's release. Marcus Smooth Henderson sat at table 7. Ribs on his plate, cognac glowing amber under bright nightclub lights, wearing the confidence of a man who believes he has inherited a kingdom. 11 years, so the story goes, Smooth had run pieces of Harlem while Bumpy was locked away, and somewhere between responsibility and opportunity, he had started to believe the empire was his by right. When Bumpy entered, he didn't storm. He arrived like an audit. He sat. He folded his napkin. Smooth smiled too quickly, the smile of a man trying to turn guilt into charm. Bumpy asked Smooth's bodyguards to step away. They hesitated, then obeyed, because even in betrayal, respect has muscle memory. Beneath the table, 3 loyal men held shotguns angled down, invisible but close enough to be felt. Bumpy set a straight razor on the table, not pointed at anyone, just present, the way a signature sits on a document. 11 years, Bumpy said, as if counting interest. Smooth tried to explain, to bargain, to dress ambition in the language of necessity. But what does explanation buy when trust has already been sold? The razor moved with a surgeon's restraint, enough to mark, not to kill. A thin line opened on Smooth's cheek, a red stroke that turned his face into a public statement. The room froze. 250 people, maybe more, held their breath together, because they understood the punishment wasn't the pain, it was permanence. Bumpy leaned in. You'll remember this, the story says. Smooth was allowed to leave alive, carrying a scar that Harlem could read like a headline. Betrayal doesn't always earn death, but it always earns a name. Finally, 1948, Wells Restaurant. The confrontation that proved Bumpy's strongest weapon wasn't his razor, his money, or his intelligence. It was the room itself. The restaurant smelled like ribs and pepper, collard greens and warm grease, the kind of place where ordinary people ate after ordinary days. About 40 diners filled the space, and Bumpy sat with his wife, eating quietly, as if he were just another man protecting a private moment. When Sal Bonanno walked in with 6 armed bodyguards, he brought arrogance like a spotlight. Sal spoke with the entitlement of bloodline, and Harlem accounts say he let a racial slur hang in the air as if it was harmless. The room stiffened. Forks stopped midair. Conversation died. And Bumpy did not reach for a gun. He placed the razor on the table and looked around, not at Sal first, but at the faces of the diners. The butcher whose nephew's medical bill had been paid, the mother whose son had been escorted safely home, the shop owner who had been spared a beating because Bumpy's name was enough. Then Bumpy looked back at Sal and delivered 6 words with the calm of a man reading tomorrow's weather. Your uncle will bury you tomorrow. It wasn't just a threat. It was a statement about how fast power can erase a reckless heir. Sal's confidence drained as he realized the room wasn't neutral. It had chosen. The apology came not because Sal suddenly respected Bumpy, but because he understood something more frightening. In Harlem, disrespect doesn't start a fight, it starts a verdict. Sal apologized to Bumpy's wife. He backed out with 6 guns that never rose. And the lesson traveled again, faster than police sirens, faster than newspapers. Harlem could be approached with money, with negotiation, even with fear, but it could not be humiliated without consequence. 5 confrontations, 5 messages. In darkness, coordination collapses. In public, betrayal becomes shame. In velvet rooms, photographs outweigh bullets. In bright clubs, scars outlive speeches. And in a modest restaurant, the community itself becomes the weapon. The question underneath all of it remained the same: growing heavier with each retelling. If power is not just violence, then what is it? Money, strategy, or the quiet agreement of people who refuse to abandon you? What made Bumpy Johnson dangerous was never the moment itself. It was what happened afterward, when the story escaped the room and became a rule. The Cotton Club basement didn't end with bodies on concrete. It ended with a symbol traveling upward into the daylight. The man who crawled out, Harlem lore often names him Marty Delaney, didn't run to the police, because police reports didn't matter in a world where reputation was law. He ran to the people who did matter, the men who counted money, controlled corners, and measured risk like accountants. The Ace of Spades became a whisper passed hand to hand. 12 went in, 1 came out, and the one man who was supposed to die walked away with Harlem still in his pocket. Whether every detail held up under a courtroom light didn't matter to the streets. What mattered was the conclusion the streets drew. Dutch Schultz could buy gunmen, but he couldn't buy the room. He couldn't buy the neighborhood's consent. And once a community decides it won't consent, violence stops being a shortcut and starts being a liability. From that point on, Harlem's underworld began to shift from chaos into something colder. A structure built on consequences. When later history recorded Schultz being killed in 1935 after clashing with larger mafia interests, Harlem heard the lesson differently. Even the loudest predator can be erased when he becomes bad for business, and Harlem had already proven it could make predators expensive. Bumpy's power grew because it felt inevitable, not because it felt random. Accounts of his alliance building after the Schultz era often describe a new kind of balance. Deals over invasions, percentages over occupations, and Harlem's own men controlling the streets while outsiders took cuts quietly. That balance is exactly why the 1946 Stork Club negotiation echoes in so many retellings. The meeting matters not because it was glamorous, but because it formalized an idea. Harlem could be taxed but not occupied. Luciano, facing his own storms and eventually deported, returned to Italy with his empire threatened by distance. Yet the agreement Harlem lore calls 10% survived precisely because it wasn't sentimental, it was efficient. When profit flows, egos learn to compromise. And when exposure becomes the weapon on the table, even bosses choose the safer path. The Lennox Lounge incident in 1958 sharpened the rule into something personal. 300 witnesses didn't just see a betrayal fail. They saw what Bumpy did with the victory. The click was humiliating, but the envelope was devastating. In Harlem's moral arithmetic, killing Sam would have been expected. Sparing him, then paying the bill that drove him to betrayal, turned the punishment into a permanent bruise. Big Sam's exit became a moving caution sign for everyone watching from the edges. Some accounts place him drifting toward Detroit, disappearing into construction work and anonymity, but the geography is less important than the outcome. Exile. A man can survive without blood on the floor and still lose everything that makes him a man in Harlem. His name, his belonging, his right to look people in the eye. That story traveled into mafia rooms as a new calculation. If Bumpy can predict betrayal before it happens, then plotting against him is like gambling with loaded dice. Small's Paradise in 1963 completed the transformation of Bumpy's legend from survival to governance. The scar on Smooth's cheek, cut with restraint instead of rage, became a public document. Harlem didn't need a funeral to understand the message. It needed a face. And once that face existed, smaller crews stopped reaching for Smooth's old corners, not because they feared death, but because they feared being marked as the kind of man the neighborhood stops respecting. That distinction, fear of death versus fear of disgrace, is how Bumpy's order maintained itself longer than violence usually allows. Wells Restaurant, too, gained a second life as a location, because it proved Bumpy's strongest defense wasn't a gun or a razor. It was the room. 40 diners didn't pull triggers. They pulled reality into alignment. Their silence, their attention, their history with him, all turned a reckless insult into a losing position for Sal Bonanno. Later retellings sometimes claim Sal never returned to Harlem and died young. Some say a heart attack in the early 1950s, but even if the dates blur, the aftermath stays clear. Harlem became a place where outsiders learned to lower their voices. And over all of it sat the larger arc that even official biographies agree on. Bumpy's story included prison years, including Alcatraz, and yet he returned to Harlem with his name intact, which is almost unheard of in an ecosystem that usually replaces men like seasons. His life ultimately ended in a way that feels almost scripted by irony, collapsing at Wells Restaurant in 1968, because the same room that symbolized community and consequence also became the last place the legend breathed. The ripple effect, then, is the true ending of Part 6. A neighborhood that learned power is not only what you do in the moment, but what your moment teaches everyone else to believe afterward. Harlem didn't become untouchable because violence disappeared. It became untouchable because the cost of touching it became too high, and the rules were enforced not only by Bumpy's hands, but by Harlem's memory. By the time the smoke cleared from all 5 rooms, Harlem didn't just remember Bumpy Johnson as a survivor. It remembered him as a system, a man who understood that the most reliable kind of power is the kind that feels predictable, because predictability turns fear into discipline, and discipline turns chaos into order. Bumpy didn't win by being the loudest gun in the city. He won by being the man who could walk into any room, basement, lounge, nightclub, VIP suite, restaurant, and make everyone inside it understand the same truth. The outcome was already decided, and it wasn't decided by bullets alone. It was decided by leverage, by witnesses, by symbols, by the quiet mathematics of reputation. An ace of spades could travel farther than a corpse. A click could silence a crowd louder than a gunshot. A scar could outlive a speech. A photograph could bend a boss. And 6 words, "Your uncle will bury you tomorrow," could turn 6 armed men into 6 men walking backward. What made Harlem untouchable wasn't that it lacked enemies. It was that its enemies learned the price of disrespect was always higher than they estimated. And at the center of that lesson was a deeper, uncomfortable idea. In places where official protection fails, communities build their own versions of order, and sometimes the men enforcing that order look like villains from the outside and guardians from within. So here's the question that hangs over the whole story like that swinging light bulb. If you were Big Sam, staring at $50,000 and a child's hospital bill, would you pull the trigger even if you knew the room would remember you forever? If you were Lucky Luciano, would you choose 40% and war, or 10% and peace? If you were Smooth, would you mistake time for forgiveness? And if someone insulted you in your own house, would you reach for a gun, or would you let the room speak first? If you enjoyed this kind of long-form crime history, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video with someone who loves stories where power is explained, not just displayed. And tell us in the comments, which moment was the real turning point? The shattered bulb, the silent click, the scar, the photo, or the 6 words? The next chapter goes even deeper: Alcatraz, Malcolm X, and the Harlem secrets that never made it into headlines.